Okay, a number of years ago, I got an email from a graduate student at State University of New York in Buffalo, somebody asking for kind of how to deal with some conflicts she was having as a literature student in a very secular situation, very hostile to Christianity. I'd written a few things about that, and so she was asking me how to deal with it, and it was a Karen Swallow, and that started correspondence that went on for a long time. And I tried to, talk her through various things, and she would keep me posted about her graduate work. And she came through that in flying colors. I wrote her a letter of recommendation to try to help get her onto the faculty at Liberty University, which also worked, and that's where she is now. And so, and I've just been delighted to follow her career, follow her work as a writer. And I'm so happy to have her here for this Newsmaker interview series. Karen Swallow Pryor is one of the few writers I've known who is able to write and be an important contributor to both Christianity Today, major evangelical periodical, and the Atlantic Monthly, sort of the major mainline highbrow secular periodical, and she acquits herself so faithfully in both. A couple years ago, she sent me a manuscript that she was working on called How Literature Saved My Life. And it was a beautiful memoir of her life and how literature helped her to deal with the issues that she had been facing. That book has come out in a much worse title. It's called Booked, the literature and the soul of me. Yes. Publishers never give you the title that you wanted, but that's what it's about, how literature saved my life. Just recently, she's come out with an important biography of Hannah More, who worked with Wilberforce in the abolition of the slave trade and also in many other reform movements in England in the 19th century. And Hannah More, though, did her persuasion by literature, by her novels and her other writings. So very happy to have her here. Please welcome Karen Swallow Pryor.
Well, Dr. Veith said recently, which is factually accurate. I want to just go a little more specific on that, namely the official publication date of this book from Thomas Nelson was yesterday. So we're going to talk a lot about this book today, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Hannah More, and by the way, title here, Fierce Convictions. Better than Booked, I think. Very good title. Tell us about Hannah More's Fierce Convictions and how those developed.
Well, a lot of people have never heard of Hannah More, and so I often introduce her by calling her the female Wilberforce, or maybe we could say Wilberforce was the male Hannah More, I don't know. But Hannah More was a contemporary of the famous parliamentarian and leader of the abolitionist movement, William Wilberforce. Their lives were pretty much the same duration. They were lifelong friends, and More was sort of the pen behind the abolitionist movement. She wrote poetry and tracts and songs to appeal to the emotions and the hearts of the British people when the abolitionists were trying to end the slave trade in Great Britain. There's a lot more that she did. She was not, and she and her evangelical friends were not single-issue Christians or reformers. With Wilberforce and John Newton and other evangelicals, not only did these people with fierce convictions end the slave trade, they brought reform to high society, they improved the lives of the poor, they started the animal welfare movement. There's so many things that they did that really, I only scratched the surface in this book.
Yeah, and it really is a terrific story of perseverance. And the Wilberforce story has become well known now through some books and movies and so forth. 4 decades He worked in Parliament to try to have slavery abolished in the British Empire. After, about a decade and a half, he had a partial success of having the slave trade abolished, but it wasn't until, if I remember correctly, 1833 that Parliament actually abolished slavery in the British Empire 3 days before Wilberforce died. So there's a whole lifetime of perseverance, and happily enough, even in his lifetime, he could see the results of that. Hannah More died a couple of months after Wilberforce, and so also this is great when you work for something for a long time and you can actually see it happen in your lifetime. So let's talk a little bit more about how she developed an anti-slavery view. You wrote that she read John Newton's, and here's an interesting title of a Cardiphonia. Is that tell us about that.
Right. Well, Hannah More was born into the Church of England, like most British citizens were, and she always demonstrated sort of a pious character and a high moral bent. But when she read John Newton's Cardiphonia, which is usually translated letters of the heart or utterances of the heart, a series of letters by the famous hymn writer and former slave ship captain John Newton, that is when we first see in her correspondence an expression of what we would call today, an evangelical faith or a personal relationship with Christ. That book really moved her, and More was already committed to the abolitionist movement. But after reading that book and then traveling to hear John Newton preach in his church, she joined forces with him, and Wilberforce was soon recruited into this growing movement, and they began working together on this project that, which, as you already mentioned, took many decades to accomplish.
And she met John Newton in 1787. How old was she then?
Well, she was born in 1745, so
okay.
so someone do the math. I'm an English person.
Okay.
So
All the students here, I'm sure, have the answer of 42. Perhaps.
Right, so the middle of her life, so because she lived to be 88, and so it was right in the middle of her life that she took this turn. Okay,
and some of the influential things that got her concerned about this, there was the Zonga Massacre of 1781. Maybe tell us about that.
Right. Well, this was a famous case that went before the British Parliament, where basically the slave ship, in order to so many slaves on the ship were dying that they were going to lose money on this particular journey, so they threw the slaves overboard in order to collect the insurance money. And this was a case that one of many. I mean, it took so long to win the hearts of the British people against the slave trade, but essentially this case ruled that the insurance money, that the ship had the right to collect the insurance money. And so this was a watershed moment in the abolitionist movement in getting people to begin to see the horrors of the slave trade. So that was really the effect of the case.
Yeah, and you write, the industry was steeped in brutality at every level of execution. Slave ship captains were cruel not only to the slaves, but to the sailors. Many of them, as in John Newton's case, were taken into service by force and beaten, abused, abandoned, sometimes sold into slavery. Thousands of British sailors died or were deserted in slave colonies each year. The pervasive cruelty of the entire slave industry. So, is there any industry in our own time that has a pervasive cruelty similar to that?
Well, of course, there are so many parallels that we could think of. I mean, the one that I think is most pervasive in our culture, that is just so difficult for so many people to see, is abortion. Abortion has become so much part of our culture, not just in terms of individual lives and choices, but even in our economic basis. I mean, our whole economy has shifted and changed because of the lives that are aborted rather than born. And in the book, I talk about how slavery was so embedded into British culture that economically, socially, politically, culturally, that it was difficult to see it as a wrong or to see a society that could exist without it. Many people in England at the time acknowledged that slavery was a nasty business. I mean, one of the parliamentarians said, well, butchering isn't a pleasant business, but a mutton is a fine piece of meat or something like that. Yeah. So people could see how barbaric it was, but just not imagine life or a system without it. And I think that's where we are with abortion. I mean, there are many people who acknowledge how horrible it is or what a necessary evil it is, but it's just hard to imagine a society functioning the way ours does today without it.
So what was Hannah More's strategy in fighting slavery?
Well, while people like Wilberforce were working the political strings and doing that part, and people like Newton were preaching, and people like the Thorntons who had money were financing efforts, More was trying to move people's imaginations and their hearts through literature. And that's something that's much harder to measure. I think that's partly why Wilberforce is remembered today, because a piece of legislation that passes can go down in history. But Moore wrote a very famous poem. It's very famous at the time and has returned recently into a lot of literature anthologies. But she timed this poem called Slavery to be published on the same day that Wilberforce was introducing anti-slavery legislation in Parliament. And together, this is how they were working with the political arm, which was important, but to change the hearts and minds of the people to rally behind the cause required moving their hearts and imagination, and that's what Moore did.
And you quote chunks of that poem, Slavery, in here, and I could read some of this, but it'll sound a lot better if you read it.
Okay.
So page 129, or maybe you already have that page number memorized.
I don't, but I will be glad to read this.
Read us some of that.
Whene'er to Afric's shores I turn my eyes, horrors of deepest, deadliest guilt arise. I see by more than fancy's mirror shown the burning village and the blazing town. See the dire victim torn from social life, the shrieking babe, the agonizing wife. She, wretch forlorn, is dragged by hostile hands to distant tyrant sold in distant lands. Transmitted miseries and successive chains, the sole sad heritage her child obtains. Even this last wretched boon their foes deny, to weep together or together die. By felon hands, by one relentless stroke, see the fond links of nature broke, the fibers twisting round a parent's heart, torn from their grasp and bleeding as they part.
So how was this published and how did it get around?
Well, it was published in the way most poems were published during this time, in just, like a single...
broadside?
Right, exactly, and just circulated. Moore writes a great deal in her letters about this poem. She thought it was a very poor quality. It's much longer than this in a book today. It takes up several pages. But she wrote it in a hurry to coincide with this piece of legislation being introduced. And it was praised highly by all of their abolitionist friends, and of course we don't really know the effect that it had on people at the time, because it's such a hard thing to measure, and that's why people like Moore and their works tend not to go down in history, because it really is hard to measure the effect that they have.
And you mentioned that the verses linked the love of God and Britain to the cause of universal liberty, and the poem closed with an address to God. Maybe you could read that part.
Yes. And thou, great source of nature and of grace, who of one blood didst form the human race, look down in mercy in thy chosen time, with equal eye on Afric's suffering clime. Disperse her shades of intellectual night, repeat thy high behest, let there be light. Bring each benighted soul, great God, to thee, and with thy wide salvation make them free. The thing that this poem does that's so powerful from a literary perspective, it's hard for me not to talk about that, is that she invokes so many elements of the culture that were astir at this time. This is really, it's a romantic poem. She's appealing to people's passions and emotions. She's appealing to common humanity. Moore was not a revolutionary, yet the French Revolution was close to everyone's minds at this time. And so she taps into some of the same ideals of the French Revolution of individual liberty and equality, yet she contextualizes it on a strong Christian foundation, a moral foundation. And this poem appeals to every aspect of anyone's humanity, their emotions, their family ties, their patriotism, their love of God, their love of truth, their love of freedom. It's really a powerful work, and it is, thankfully, has been resurrected in romantic literature anthologies. Feminist critics will often point to it and praise it, and it's a powerful poem.
And so it lasted for a long time, or I guess in the publishing industry, it had legs.
Right,
you mentioned that it
right.
inspired missionaries in the 19th century, including David Livingstone.
Yes.
How
yes.
did that happen?
Well, there isn't really a direct tie that we have in the literature to, but what this poem did is it was, again, a watershed moment of helping people understand that the slaves, these people that were not seen as human beings were human beings, and that they needed to be evangelized just as anyone in Europe needed to be evangelized. So the poem helped the readers of the time to understand the humanity of Africans rather than just their being objects of trade. And this is one of the reasons why Moore is called the first Victorian, because of her reforming spirit and her evangelistic spirit helped to inspire many of the elements of the Victorian age that we want. And of course the whole missionary spirit was a very strong element of the Victorian age.
Let's talk about that in a moment, but I want you to read one more thing on page 126. This is the satiric poem in support of a boycott, published anonymously in a Bristol newspaper in 1792, but believed to be the work of Hannah More.
Right.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that boycott, and then read this part of the poem.
Yes, this was another way that Hannah More helped to appeal to people's hearts and imaginations. She led up a boycott of sugar, because sugar, or most sugar, not all sugar, but a boycott of West Indian sugar, which was produced through slave labor. And she was responding. This letter was responding to another letter that had a young boy questioning how eating sugar was any less eating Negro flesh than putting a fork or spoon made of gold or silver was putting a dead Negro's finger or toe in one's mouth. So this work, which again is attributed to Moore, although she didn't sign it, and was published in a local newspaper, says, "I own I am shocked at this purchase of slaves, and fear those who buy them and sell them are knaves. What I hear of their hardships, their tortures, and groans is almost enough to draw pity from stones. I pity them greatly, but I must be mum. For how could we do without sugar and rum? Especially sugar, so needful we see. What? Give up our desserts, our coffee and tea?"
So that speaks to the way it was so ingrained in the British economy at that point. People said, "How can we live without this?"
Exactly.
A lot of the attitudes of Virginians like Washington and Jefferson towards slavery, I mean, very similar to that in lots of ways. How can we? And I don't like it, but what can we do?
Right.
Let's parallel here. Is there anything like this that's been produced over the past 40 years concerning abortion in terms of our culture and popular culture?
Oh, that's a good question. Of course, I think one that's been talked about a lot that I think, is a good example is the film Juno. Juno was, and I don't even know that the producers of that film claim that this is what they were trying to do, but it was good art, and because that's one of the things about good art is that it does show the complexity and the humanity of a situation, and it just happens to have done it in a way that I think is very life-affirming. I don't know if there are a lot of other examples.
Back in 1990, when we had some regular meetings of pro-life leaders, I was once collecting songs, pro-life songs, and had about an hour's worth of stuff and played them for them, but none of them was all that good, didn't really catch on.
Right.
I mean, there was, some folks took, if you remember, go back to the late 80s, Madonna singing Papa Don't Preach,
Right.
Keeping My
I do
Baby.
remember that. Right,
It was interpreted in that way.
Right.
But yeah, we need songs. We don't
We
have
do.
them.
We need songs.
Do you
we
know the
need-
movie? But we need more of
Right.
that.
Now, this is a little controversial, but I happen to think that the Kill Bill Volume 1 and Volume 2 is pro-life.
How so, with all the corpses littering the floor?
No, I remember watching, I only watched those films at the behest of my students who urged me to do such things. Of course. No, I really did, and I was really, I really labored through it. But by the time I got to the end of the second volume and I saw that all of this had been done for this, because the bride was seeking the return of her child who had been taken from her.
Okay.
And at the very end, the last scene of the film is her rolling around on the floor, just thanking someone, thanking the universe for the return of her child. I mean, it's a very, it's not intended that way, but I think that's very powerful.
So, and there was art. Again, Hannah More was involved in these circles, but mention a little bit about Wedgwood and its famous picture.
Right. It's a very famous engraving that was reproduced in lots of media at the time of a kneeling slave in chains saying, "Am I not a brother?" It was a very powerful figure. You can Google that and see it reproduced in a number of different forms. But so the visual arts were very important. These abolitionists had every area of culture covered, politics, and even in the artistic realm, there were engravings. One of the most important pieces of propaganda that they have, and I use that in its neutral sense of promoting the cause, was that they researched a slave ship cargo hold, because people just did not know what was going on. Unlike in America, I can't even wrap my mind around what was happening in America at the time, but in England, the slave trade was offshore. There weren't a lot of slaves in England. People's eyes were shielded from what was going on. They didn't even know what a slave ship looked like. And so people had to be very, display ingenuity to get inside the cargo, draw what it looked like, and then they printed up, reproduced prints of this drawing of the cargo hold, and Hannah More would carry around this print in her pockets and pull it out at dinner parties and show people, this is what the cargo hold of a slave ship looks like, because people just didn't know. And to bring it back to the analogy today, it's very controversial, even within the pro-life movement, to use strategies that involve depicting or showing what happens in an abortion, and I understand how that can be a sensitive issue, but for me personally, I mean, I had my instantaneous pro-life conversion one night in church when I was watching a video of what happens during an abortion, and that just changed everything for me. Before that, I did not really understand. And so even though I think of myself as sort of a rational, intellectual person who likes to think of abstract concepts and ideas most of the time and think in those terms, I had to be confronted with a visual picture, image of what abortion entails for me to be enlightened and to understand. And so these abolitionists use all of these measures. They use visual art, they use poetry that moved the passions, they use rational argument. More wrote treatises. They wrote things for the powerful and the rich, and More wrote tracts for the poor with simpler stories, using simpler language. They covered all of the bases.
So this is a question. We can't really know the answer to it, but do you think Hannah More and the other abolitionists at the time would have been on the side of showing the bloody pictures today of abortion?
Well, I mean, as much as we can see what they did then, they were showing the pictures of what happened. I mean, they didn't have the kind of media that we have available. And based on their critics, their contemporary critics, who often thought that these guys were uptight, prudes, and I mean, Hannah More especially was lampooned for being so conservative and so pietistic and so forth. If we base it on the kinds of criticisms that they received, I think we would see them very similarly see them pretty well placed in that kind of camp.
Interesting. Let me actually ask you, because you wrote several years ago an article on abortion that I read. This is going outside the book right now, but you wrote that my opposition to abortion under any circumstances except those rare times when it is necessary to save the life of the mother is rooted in social justice, not Christian belief. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. Well, a lot of my most deeply held beliefs and values are rooted in my Christian belief. But sometimes, that doesn't mean that those things should be political or cultural mandates. I mean, I believe that salvation is of the Lord, but I don't believe in forcing people to accept Christ as their Savior. Yet that's my profoundest belief. My opposition to abortion is based in, just sort of accepting the simple fact that an individual life begins at conception. It does, I have a little puppy at home. Her name is Ruby. I love her very much, and her life began at conception. I'm quite certain of it. And so human life begins at conception. And when we're talking about human life, then we are talking about civil rights and human rights. And I don't believe that I need to be a Christian to believe in the protection of human life. Now, my Christian faith compels me to respond to that injustice in a certain way and to confront it. But in terms of my belief about what is right or wrong in terms of taking human life, that's just something that's based, I think, in just rational thought.
So being pro-life isn't for Christians only?
Absolutely
actually.
not,
Yeah.
right.
You also dealt here, and I don't know if this plays into thinking a lot, but you also dealt, when you were writing about this, about that whole ensoulment issue and so forth. And tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as again, here's my abstract theoretical mind. I honestly don't know when ensoulment occurs. I mean, I know that there are different beliefs throughout Christian history, throughout Judaic thinking. I think because human life begins at conception, it may begin at conception. I don't know, but that is actually a legitimate religious question, and not germane to the question of whether or not we, as a secular society, have the right to take the life of this being. I mean, some people don't even believe that in a soul, and that's okay, but that doesn't mean that they can go around and kill people just because they believe we don't have souls. That's really not part of the question.
Okay, so. Somewhat like, I mean, this was Ronald Reagan's famous statement on this back in the 1980s. If you're in the forest and you're looking and you're not sure whether it's a deer or a human, you don't shoot. Right. Basically.
Excellent analogy. Right.
So,
right.
And then the whole question of the effects of this and illegality and how that you mentioned that. It goes without saying that any act made illegal makes that act more difficult and dangerous to carry out. And certainly that would be true of abortion. I think you were talking about the other victim in abortion, basically the mother
right.
in this situation. The fact that some people will break a law has never been nor should be the sole basis for determining whether or not a law should exist. There'll always be those who violate any given law. And I suppose here's the parallel between the question of abortion illegality now and the Britain making the slave trade illegal in 1807, the United States making the slave trade illegal in 1808.
Right.
So that, go ahead.
Right, yeah, no, that is, I think there's so much instructive in that because, now, Eric Metaxas makes this point in his introduction to Amazing Grace, the biography of William Wilberforce, and this point stuck with me a great deal. He says that what the abolition of the slave trade did in both England and America and throughout the world, I think recently, only a few years ago, the last country in the world outlawed the slave trade. It has not eliminated slavery. We know that. We know that human trafficking right. still goes on. But what happened is that we no longer, as a society, accept it, at least theoretically. And it's a huge shift in thinking about the issue. So even though trafficking and slavery still exists, we as a society across the world no longer accept it. And so I think that the same can be said, and I really do believe will be said about abortion. I really do believe that someday we will look back, although abortion will always exist, just as it always has, but I believe that we will look back one day and we will be amazed and chagrined and puzzled that we could ever have tolerated as a society such a practice. Just as I'll throw in another issue there, this is something I'm coming along with in my own thinking, so I'm not quite there yet, but I think we'll also look that way on inhumane factory farming practices as well. I think that we will look at that issue and wonder how we could ever have been so barbaric.
And do you think the folks who are opposed to inhumane factory animal production will apply that to human life?
I think someday they might, and hope they will. But we are just like the 18th to the 19th century British and Americans. We are stuck in a lot of our own contradictions and can't always see things as clearly in the midst of them as we will in history. But I hope that we will.
So, in other
see
words,
those.
so how can we, since our economy is so entwined with slavery 2 centuries ago, how can we live without it? Since our economy is so entwined with factory farming,
right.
and since our economy is so entwined with abortion,
Right. How could we?
how can we live without it?
Right.
So
Well,
some
right.
must die, that others will live, basically.
Right.
Well, the parallels are there. Let's go back to Hannah More for a moment and other stuff in this book. During her 6-year engagement, she had to put up 3 times with the groom backing out.
Right.
And she never did marry.
Right.
Is there a connection between that her experience and at that point just being disgusted with the whole thing, or
Right. Well, it's interesting. I see the providence of God so much in that part of her life because so many things happened in that relationship. She was engaged to someone who was above her class, a wealthy landowner. Moore was born to a poor schoolmaster, and so because she was teaching at a school for newly wealthy young ladies, she was introduced to this wealthy landowner who was 20 years her senior, and they seemed to have made a very compatible pair with similar moral and aesthetic and cultural tastes and so forth. But his cold feet resulted in her finally breaking it off, and as was customary at the time, because a woman who had experienced a broken engagement was somewhat considered damaged goods, unfortunately. It was common for the gentleman to settle an annuity of some sort, some financial compensation on the woman. And now Hannah did not seek this herself, but her family and friends intervened and insisted that financial compensation be made, and her fiancé gladly agreed, but they made her accept it. And it's that money that allowed her to quit her job teaching and pursue her life as a writer. And that's when she made her way to London and was welcomed by the London literati and became introduced to the most powerful people in England at the time and opened up these doors of influence for her. She did have at least one other offer to marry, and she never did, and none of her sisters married. That's sort of an unusual thing. All 5 sisters remained single and for most of their lives lived in sort of a family together. And there are lots of dynamics around that, but in the case of Moore's story itself, I mean, she never would have been able to accomplish what she had if she had married and then most likely had children. I just believe God had a different call on her life, and this is what he had her to do.
Interesting. Then she also, here's something from what she wrote to John Newton in 1796 about the project she was engaged in. One great benefit, the removal of the great gulf which has divided rich and poor in these country parishes by making them meet together, whereas before they hardly thought they were children of one common father. So what was her anti-poverty work like?
Well, Moore was one of the early founders of the Sunday schools. There were Robert Raikes came before her, as well as Sarah Trimmer. Those names are a little bit more famous in the Sunday school movement. But what Moore did is back in her area of England, in the West Country, she opened about 11 Sunday schools throughout the countryside. And Sunday schools then were not what we think of them now. They weren't where you just spent an hour learning Bible lessons. It was actually school on Sundays for the poor. The poor had no means of education other than the charity schools, and someone had to pay for them to go to that. So on Sunday, the only day when the poor children were not working, doing hard labor, Moore and her sisters opened these schools, hired teachers to come in and teach the students to read, which was very controversial. Teaching the poor to read was feared by many to fuel revolutionary impulses. They thought that if the poor could read, then they could organize and start a revolution like one that had been started in France and earlier in America. And so it was very controversial, but this was based on Moore's Christian beliefs that everyone needed to be able to read the Bible for themselves and to learn Bible stories, to learn to live a biblical, godly life. And so she taught reading, she taught catechism, she taught skills that could improve the chances of getting better jobs and better labor for the poor. She soon brought in the parents of the children to help them as well. And this was something that many of the wealthy feared. They feared the idea of improving the lot of the poor. That was again a condition that was considered to be a given. Like if you were born poor, that's what God meant. If you were born wealthy, that's what God meant, and there was no reason to try to change things or to upset the status quo. So this was, although Moore was not a revolutionary by any means, in a sense, these efforts at reform were revolutionary for the time.
Yeah, very interesting. And a well-written book I recommend it to all of you. I do want to mention, we'll go to your questions in just a moment, but I want to mention another book that Karen wrote, came out 2 years ago, called Booked. And in particular, you mentioned some of you start out at the beginning mentioning some of the great works of literature like Richard Scarry's Busy, Busy World, and Clifford the Big Red Dog, and so forth, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So as you're thinking about questions, let me just ask you this. Okay, what is your very favorite children's book? What is, you have chapters on different novels. What is your very favorite novel? And then third, I think in that book you say that your favorite song is Don McLean's American Pie. But I'm not sure. Maybe I'm imagining that. I like that song. But anyway, so those are my three questions for you quickly. Favorite children's book, favorite novel, favorite song.
Favorite children's book. Okay, there are so many. I'm going to say Black Beauty. Is that a children's? That's children's, right? Okay. My favorite novel is Jane Eyre.
Okay.
It's hard to pick. I have 4, but I'll pick. Might be Great Expectations. Okay. And my favorite song, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I do love American Pie. I don't know if that is my favorite. Oh, that's really hard.
You can think about it some more.
I'll think about that some more.
As people, questions from anyone here?
So would you talk a little bit about how literature saved your life?
Okay. Well, and I'll connect the two books, too, because it might seem strange to go from a literary memoir to a biography. And by the way, I'll never write another biography. It was really harder than I thought it would be. I'm not a historian, so I had to train myself to be one. But just as I talked about earlier, that what Hannah More did was to change her society by moving the imagination and the heart and the passions through literature. That's what my book Booked is about. It's really about it's a memoir of how my favorite books and works of literature shaped me as a person, shaped my soul, shaped my thinking, and really changed my life. And what I say in the book is that even though I grew up in the church and was raised by godly parents who are here with me today, that for me, as a lover of books, I feel like I learned a lot more about God and learned and had much more spiritual formation through great works, literary works, than I did in church and Sunday school. That may not be right, but that's just how it was for me. So, and that's what the book is about, is sharing that kind of spiritual formation that I had through literary works.
But saved your life, that's a very strong formulation.
Well, for example, I talk about in the chapter on Great Expectations, I talk about the magic of story and how story can help inform our understanding of the world. In my chapter on Jane Eyre, I talk about my struggles as an adolescent. We all, adolescence is defined by struggle, but I really was losing myself, including the self that was a Christian and was called to be a Christian, yet was getting caught up in peer pressure in the world, that Jane Eyre helped me understand how to be true to the self that God created me to be instead of the one that the world was beckoning me to be. And in the chapter on another favorite novel of mine, Madame Bovary, I talk about how I really was sucked into the romantic worldview, and I think that I really feel like I came close to that worldview being my undoing in many ways, but Flaubert showed me the errors of that way of thinking. So my life is what it is today because of these great books.
Other questions?
So I'm a little curious, did Hannah More have to make any great sacrifices to pursue this life that she led? What did she give up?
Well, of course, it wasn't her, she didn't willingly, but she did give up being married and being a wife and that sort of life that is what most women at the time did. I think the biggest sacrifices that she made have to do with her own personal comfort. She did suffer throughout her life from bouts of frail health, including bouts of what I think we would consider today to be depression. She was a person who really wanted to be accepted and praised by other people, and that, of course, can be a weakness, and it was her weakness. But it also, so when she was criticized, she took it very, very badly, and it often precipitated one of her illnesses that would take her to her bed for weeks or months or even years. So in that sense, she had to overcome those physical and sort of existential weaknesses in order to continue. I mean, she would always end up rallying. Her friends would say, we need you to write this, or we need you to address that. And she would rally herself and do it, even though I think her personality was such that she would rather have withdrawn from the world and not been in the midst of controversy. And so for her, that really was a great sacrifice, to keep getting back into the ring of the cultural wars and to keep fighting.
So in what ways was she a feminist, and in what ways wasn't she?
I love that question, because, of course, the term feminist wasn't used then. It wouldn't come about until later in the 19th century. But critics today often look at her and try to, say either she was or she wasn't. And most people want to compare her to her contemporary, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and who is considered now the mother of feminism, and whom More famously refused to read. Her friends were urging her to read Wollstonecraft's work, and she wouldn't. More did not believe in rights for women. She thought it would be as ridiculous to talk about the rights of children. So any card-carrying feminists today would be loath to call someone like that a feminist. Yet, More brought about really radical changes for women's education at the time. She wanted women to be educated in significant and substantial ways, and not just be taught how to play the harpsichord and paint so that they could attract a husband and then never use those skills again. She wanted them to have real character-forming education, things that would make them better wives and mothers and citizens. And so I think by the best terms of the definition of feminism, I think More was. She wanted women to be strong in their femininity and strong in their Christian calling, and I think that's something we would all agree that all women should be.
Karen, thanks a lot for being here today. You're a professor at Christian University. I'm just wondering, are you encouraged among the students that you teach that you're seeing fierce convictions on causes that you feel that you have future leaders coming up through the ranks?
I think for all of the criticism that gets bandied about the millennial generation, and I certainly have offered my criticisms, I am encouraged. I think this generation of students is passionate, and they're seeking authenticity, and hopefully in the best sense of the term. I mean, they're perverted understandings of that word, but they really do want to live lives filled with meaning and purpose. And I think they're looking at the failures of past generations, our materialism, our consumerism, and so forth, and they're wanting something more and better than that. They're facing many obstacles that are disheartening, but I am encouraged. I am encouraged by students today.
Right on the obstacles?
Well, I think the obstacles are obviously the economy. The obstacles are, I think, the divisions that are characterizing the church right now. I think there's some polarizing forces that are causing some cynicism and pessimism among students. And so I think there's a temptation to throw out the baby with the bathwater and maybe give up church membership and traditional authority and so forth. But I think that there are a seeking generation, and I really do believe that those who seek truth will find it, and so that's what gives me more optimism about them.
I read last night some of your very good articles in The Atlantic. I recommend that. One of them was why Shakespeare belongs in prison. Basically, can you guess, why does Shakespeare belong in prison?
Shakespeare belongs in prison because, well, number one, Shakespeare belongs in all of our lives. His works have so much to teach us about just simply being human and all the forces that work against us, the way that we're all sort of imprisoned by our own humanity, and yet how there is freedom available to all of us. So I think Shakespeare resonates with prisoners for a number of reasons and helps us get outside of ourselves. I mean, really, that's what we all need to do. And so in that sense, we're all prisoners of ourselves, and Shakespeare helps us to get outside of ourselves.
Okay. Another one of your articles, I learned everything I needed to know about marriage from Pride and Prejudice. Tell us about everything you needed to know about marriage.
That is one of my favorite ones. I haven't read it in a while, so there was a long list. I think a couple of Pride and Prejudice is so great. It is another one of my favorites. But a couple of things. You do marry your family. We see that in all the marriages that take place in Pride and Prejudice, that the family dynamics are very much a part of the relationship. What else did I have in there? You're going to have to...
Well, I don't know if this is really appropriate, but you can judge a man by the size of his library.
Well, I'm glad you said that one, because I think that is my favorite one. Always in Austen, there are lots of misjudgments of character and so forth, which is what makes them comedies. But you can always tell if a man is a good character if he has a good library and a large library, and that's definitely true in Pride and Prejudice.
Well, and the best marriages balance prudence and passion.
Yes. The marriages, again, there are several marriages in Pride and Prejudice, and they can be categorized sort of as being ones just rooted in passion, or ones that are just sort of, the right, reasonable thing to do. And, of course, Elizabeth and Darcy's marriage is one that brings together their passion for one another, but also it's a rational, reasonable fit. And so I think that is really the most important lesson, because it's not, it's easy to be passionate about a lot of things, but there needs to be rationality and reason behind it as well, and that's true in our relationships as much as it is anything else.
Okay, so a couple of days ago, I caught up with the very fine movie Frozen. Okay, where there's a certain that same lesson in a sense that don't say yes to a person who proposes to you after you've only known each other for an hour.
Right.
That's one of the basic lessons which girls need to know, right? I mean, guys do. So, and then also, I think you conclude with this: marry someone who will develop you into a better person.
Yes, and of course, I was writing for The Atlantic, and this was and I think did I say something about iron sharpening iron in there or something? Yes. So this was my way of. I think the whole article represented biblical truth, but this was my most overt biblical reference that is what God designs marriage for, is that it's a service, a ministry to Christ. We're supposed to reflect the marriage between Christ and the church, and Christ makes his bride better, and that is what marriage on this earth is designed for. And so I'm thankful that I was able to bring that biblical view of marriage to a secular audience through a work like Pride and Prejudice and, just an article like that.
So is a secular version of this, in a way, the movie with Tom Cruise where he says, you complete me, basically, to a young lady? Or is that a selfish way of looking at things? He didn't talk about him completing her, but anyway.
Right. I don't buy into that "you complete me" version of marriage, because I think in the two people improving one another, we're talking about two complete people who are made complete through the act of marriage centered on Christ. So it's not a matter of one person completing another.
Okay. Well, then the other thing you write about, and this may be particularly relevant to Patrick Henry students here: get married young. Basically, is your advice. In a way, have it be the cornerstone rather than the capstone.
Right. I approached that one fairly delicately. I posed it as one option to look at, because I don't think everyone should get married young. But I think in our culture today, it's almost never even considered as an option. And I think it's not. We need to look at it as a legitimate and often favorable model of marriage, and so I basically contrast the idea of marriage being a capstone, the thing that you do after you've had your education and your career and accumulated all the material possessions that you hope to have, or nearly all of them, and then you get married. I think the cornerstone model of marriage is much more biblical, and that if you make that a cornerstone for what things God has you do in life, whatever path that takes you on. And again, I'm not giving a blanket recommendation, and there are many people who would even desire that model, but it's not available to them, and I understand that. I have lots of friends in that category, but I think our culture just is wrong in looking at marriage as being sort of a feather in the cap as opposed to, a foundation.
Well, and there's so much talk about evangelicals in their 20s or children who have grown up in Christian families, and in their 20s they're not involved with the church at all, and is this disaster on its way? I just wonder if how much the postponement of marriage has to do with that. And so in many ways the comparison should not be people in their 20s now compared to maybe 40 years ago, but people in their 20s 40 years ago compared to people in their 30s now, given the way that marriage does mature people, as you say, the cornerstone rather than the capstone. Are you, as you look, for example, at Liberty University for 15 years, or others, are you concerned about this next generation and whether they will still be in the church, or do you think some of those concerns that we hear a lot about are exaggerated?
I think that I might tend toward optimism too much here, but I think that I think the church is learning a lot from the young people's disillusionment with church. Some of that disillusionment is ill-founded and just based in youth and so forth, but I think that there are a lot of ex-evangelicals, to use the term, out there, not the bitter ones, but the thoughtful ones, who are offering some helpful criticism to the church. And I know that the young people are challenging me to look at some of the things that I've taken for granted about the church, and I think that that young people are they're actually looking for more tradition and more less of an emphasis on individualism and relevance and so forth, and that's, the church has gone too far in trying to be relevant, and a lot of young people are demanding more accountability and authority, and maybe there's going to be a sharper division between those who want that kind of tradition and authority from the church and those who don't. But I think that's okay too, because I think if it helps the church return to being what it is supposed to be in the culture, that's a net win.
Okay. Other questions for any of you?
I'll ask another. One thing that came to me as you were talking about Hannah More and thinking in terms with your other book also, it seems that what a lot of Christian writers and Christian musicians and Christian artists are doing today is trying to make work that, for example, a filmmaker, that's entertaining and that will fit the commercial mainstream, but be moral and maybe have a good theological theme or something. Whereas what Hannah More was trying to do is change the imagination of her readers so that they can react to something that's horribly evil and see and feel what's so evil about it. And that's a very different task, isn't it, for a Christian writer? Even the others you met, you wrote about, Madame Bovary, shows the futility and foolishness and anguish of adultery, for example. And so that a Christian writer today might have the task of helping readers see and feel just how horrible abortion really is, or how wrong sexual immorality is, or some of these other things. But again, it requires a different kind of writing than just the kind of passive try to be popular and try to join the mainstream, but be Christian while doing it. This is much more. Well, it requires a lot more art, among other things.
Well, and that is what Moore did so brilliantly, is she took the popular forms of literature and then adapted them to her, her moral and didactic ends. Most critics today agree that her best art was in her tracts, the cheap tracts for the poor, because tracts were very popular. I mean, they were really called cheap tracts because they were cheap. And so the poor who were just learning to read were basically looking for, something they could afford to read and something they could afford to buy, and it was at their reading level. So it would be a cheap pamphlet with a silly song or a licentious story or bawdy pictures or whatever. So Moore produced a whole series of them, and she actually elevated the art form. So critics praise her for she hired the best illustrator and in London, had him make beautifully illustrated covers that were very detailed rather than the generic ones that the street vendors were selling. And so she made these very attractive covers, and then inside would be this tale that was, or a song or a poem that would be very entertaining but was imparting a moral lesson. And so her tracts were really actually the best of the form at the time. And then she wrote one novel. Novels were still at that time considered sort of base forms of entertainment, usually tales of illicit love. Well, she wrote a tale about a young man looking for a suitable wife. And so she took that popular form and adapted it to her moral ends, and it was one of England's first best-selling novels. Now, it hasn't passed the test of time. I don't recommend you read it now unless you're doing some scholarship. It's not very good, but for the time, it met the needs of the audience at the time. Yeah. Yep. Yes, they were contemporaries. Jane Austen says in one of her letters that everyone was pressuring her to read Hannah More's novel, Caleb in Search of a Wife, but she refused to because she doesn't like the evangelicals. And so while Hannah More was a best-selling writer in her lifetime, as I said, she didn't pass the test of time. No one was reading Jane Austen during her lifetime, and she didn't become popular until later on. And so I'm a big believer in the test of time, and Austen's works definitely are superior artistically, but More's goals were otherwise. I mean, she had a different purpose.
My last question, you so much like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that in your 101-year-old house, you say you have lots of wardrobes. How many wardrobes do you have?
Oh, more than my husband would like. He doesn't actually like them. Actually, I think I only have 2 or 3 right now.
Oh.
Yes, oh. Yeah. So, my husband is not a fan of them at all. So they're more aesthetic than functional.
I see. Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Karen for coming.
Thank you for having me.